And you're very welcome. This is The Beautiful Truth with Fintan Dunn reporting. So what is 9/11 deja vu? It's not quite like regular deja vu. It's a persistent, recurring feeling that a grievous and horrible crime has been committed, mass murder, and that the perpetrators have not been brought to justice. It's a feeling that just won't leave. Now, if you're new to the analysis here on breakfornews.com, you might be saying to yourself, I've been in and out of all the detail on 9/11. Well, I've got news for you. That's precisely how you're supposed to feel. Get it? And if you're going to talk to anybody else about the 9/11 issue, somebody who's clued in, who's been through the material, that's the first point you should make to them in trying to get across what we're dealing with here in this new series. Inasmuch as the existing set of red herrings that have been fed to us have been lots of detail, then the devil has been in the detail on 9/11. And that detail is an orgy of evidence. And you can Google that, orgy of evidence, breakfornews.com, to get to the audio about that topic and the use of that tactic against you. So, bearing that in mind, inasmuch as I say, it's been about the detail, instead, we're going to approach it from the opposite end, and we're going to look from the big picture and drill down to the detail. That's how Albert Einstein worked it out. That's how breakthroughs are made. Albert Einstein comes up with a new big picture and then begins to drill down to the detail. That's how you can tell what's really going on, and that's what we'll be doing. We'll be starting with the big picture. And speaking of big pictures, you might remember the movie Get Shorty. Danny DeVito says to John Travolta, he asks him in relation to a movie he's being pitched, he says, well, what's my motivation here? Good question. Because the issue of motivation is at the core of the 9/11 issue. Why would they do it? In any murder, what is the motive? No point in having suspicions about somebody. If a team of detectives is working on a murder case, okay, they may have suspicions, but the question is, so what was the motive? And from the motive, we can work out who did it. So, what was the motive? Now, in this regard, the years have been kind to us, though they are coming up on 9 long years since the event. They've been kind to us in this regard that in the early days of 9/11 research, a lot of people looking for a motive looked to the oil in Iraq, perhaps, as the motive, or the military-industrial complex wanting to start a new war as the motive, or wanting to go after the oil pipelines in Afghanistan as the motive, or it being Bush and the neocons and Dick Cheney and all that horrible, nasty right-wing crew who surely must be the kind of people who would have pulled that kind of thing off. And yet, as I say, the years have been kind to us because they've broadened our understanding of how screwed we are. Not just screwed by Republicans, screwed by Democrats, screwed by the Washington power structure, by the Washington-London New World Order. In fact, a new motive for 9/11 has begun to loom, and that motive is money. And in a previous audio at the beginning of this year, I mentioned that what's missing is something in the order of in excess of $200 trillion from the United States is missing. So does that sound like motive enough? Could it be one of the core motives? Is it a big enough figure for you? Let's just estimate it conservatively at 200 trillion, accounting for about 120 trillion of unfunded and current liabilities of the United States government, and at least the same again in disappeared national assets, manufacturing capability, economic strength, wasted, gone, transferred overseas. That's enough motivation. So what is that big picture? Well, let's use Google Earth to look at the site of the World Trade Center from overhead and then begin to zoom out. We don't zoom out very far before we realize that the events of 9/11 took place not a stone's throw from Wall Street, the center of financial power of the New World Order in the United States. And so we ask, considering the motive, considering the money, what's the relationship between the Wall Street boys and what happened on 9/11? Now, I know you seasoned veterans want to just get straight on with it, but there may be those for whom this is the first audio they've tuned into on the 9/11 issue. So for those of you who do wish to catch up on where we're at so far on breakfornews.com on this issue, you could begin by googling WAG the WTC and take a read of that article. That will take you back to within weeks of 9/11, that first investigative article. You could then Google CIA fakes. Just click on the first link that comes up, which details a lot of our analysis of the 9/11 issue. Then you could try the forum on breakfornews.com. The 9/11 section there has a series of audios called 9/11 Without Tinfoil, about 6-7 audios there. And then you can check the 9/11 section of breakfornews.com in entirety. And there you'll find a lot of very smart analysis over a long time by a lot of smart people. That's how, if you're new to all this, you can catch up with where we've got to so far. So now, let's move on. So, how do we get a handle on something as complex as the relationship between the financial markets and the political structures, both in London and in New York, at the heart of our problems? It's such a vast topic, it's so complicated, there's just so many different perspectives on it. But for me, one perspective stands out. It's the perspective of an individual who is supremely qualified, because we're talking about somebody who was a spectacularly successful hedge fund trader. We're also talking about somebody who had legendary capacity to predict the markets, or it would be legendary if only this person was a bit more well known. Someone who dealt at governmental level and who knows all of the key players. There's one other thing. This person's currently incarcerated, a guest of the US judicial system. This is somebody who is imprisoned at this time. Some of you may have guessed it already. I'm talking about, of course, Martin Armstrong. Martin who, you say? Never heard of him. Well, that's no thanks to the mainstream media. Gretchen Morgenstern in the New York Times, one of the few journalists in the New York Times, has covered his story, as has Money Week in the UK in 2007. So just to start off about who this guy is, if you haven't heard about him, and somebody that I've been following for some years, just put Martin Armstrong into Google and up will come a CIApedia, or Wikipedia to give it its other name, a Wikipedia article about Martin Armstrong. I'm going to quote from that. Martin Armstrong, born 1950, is the former chairman of Princeton Economics International Limited. Indicted in 1999 on charges of bilking Japanese investors, he spent 7 years jailed for contempt of court before finally pleading guilty in 2007. He's now serving a 5-year sentence for conspiracy to commit fraud. And that doesn't even begin to touch on the egregious abuse of judicial process in the Armstrong case. Incredible. Let me quote from the New Yorker article about Martin Armstrong on that issue of what happened in the trial, so-called, eventually. In Armstrong's civil trial, the judge, Richard Owen, demanded that for potential restitution he surrender about $15 million in gold bars and coins that it was believed he had, along with a number of antiques. He produced some of what was asked for, but not much, claiming he no longer owned the rest of it. The judge ruled that Armstrong was in contempt and sent him to jail. Armstrong wound up spending 7 years without his criminal case going to trial, the longest federal contempt incarceration in the nation's history. Each year, Judge Owen upheld the contempt order. Eventually, Martin Armstrong got smart. I mean, if he had the gold, he would have given that up long ago to get out, but he didn't, I don't think, or he would have. He got smart, he pleaded guilty, and he got a 5-year sentence. Didn't take into account the fact that he'd spent 7 years already incarcerated on contempt charges. No, the 5 years started from when he pled guilty, and he's due out in 2012. That's Martin Armstrong, and he's somebody who I think is uniquely qualified because of the scope of his understanding across the judicial and political and financial systems. He's also a terrific analyst. He's a student of cyclic systems in markets and how they operate, fractal structures. I'll also link a great article by Martin Armstrong about that topic alone, and I'll put that in the forum also. So this is somebody who is a very competent individual who became a millionaire by the age of 15. He started off working in a rare stamp and coin dealership. He then went on to form his own funds. He went on to develop his own cyclic theories, and he correctly predicted the top before the downturn in the Nikkei index, the Japanese index, in 1989. He also predicted the high in the US equity markets in July 20th, 1998. He also correctly predicted the high in March 2007, and he predicts that there will be a low in the markets in June of 2011. Now, there's one other thing about Martin Armstrong. He's somebody who does not believe that there is a deeper, broad conspiracy behind the 9/11 event. And that's who we're using as a guide, because it doesn't matter whether he buys into it. And I'm going to criticize some of the conclusions he reaches in as we go through his material, and just point out where I think he's failing to connect some dots. But Martin Armstrong's immense value to us all is that he has this knowledge and insight of the markets and the personal experience, and he is, I think, going to help us paint a picture. And I will disagree with him on points where I feel he's failing to connect the dots that may help us connect dots. What I've done is to take a selection of material and form it into a narrative extracted from a number of papers by Martin Armstrong. So what he actually does, he does this stuff up on typewriters in jail, and then he puts in illustrations manually. The stuff is photostated, is turned into a PDF, is turned into a scrollable file on scribd.com, SCRIBD.com. Martin Armstrong, into that you'll find his material there. So I've compiled from a number of recent documents a narrative, one which takes us behind the curtain. And I'll be back with that right after this. I'm quoting from Martin Armstrong now. Is Goldman Sachs the evil empire? That seems to be the question that a lot of people have in their minds. There are far too many coincidences to just be overlooked, with ex-Goldman people in strategic, political appointed posts. Rolling Stone magazine, in an article called The Great American Bubble Machine, argued that Goldman Sachs has been behind every major bubble since the Great Depression. I've called it the club, and it's time we explore this in detail, because what's been going on behind the curtain is threatening everyone, and even the future of our children. But make no mistake, it was not the Federal Reserve who was to regulate the investment banks. That was the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, and it was the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC. It was the SEC and the CFTC who have wiped out your future. Never in my wildest dreams did I ever expect to stumble upon such an inherent corruption that evolved without any true understanding of what it was evolving into. My deep concern is the vast majority of what people call Wall Street is getting a very bad name because of a small group of very sophisticated specialists in market manipulations. And my purpose here is to bring to light what I and others have been watching progress for nearly 2 decades. It's not Wall Street as a whole that is the problem. We can regulate them to the extreme, but the ones who created this mess control the real strings of power and will never be touched, no matter what the propaganda claims. I'm concerned about our future. It's time that we face our demons and bring real reform. Now, we can't begin to fairly review what's taken place without understanding that the financial industry that is unfortunately just called Wall Street is far from one giant industry. Today we have a prolific industry that's truly evolved since 1971 in a dynamic way, and that has on the one hand built the status of the United States, and yet on the other hand has contributed to its diminished respect internationally. So enough of the blame game, because stockbrokers no more deserve blame than commodity brokers or commercial banks for the most part. The blame rests squarely on the shoulders of the investment bankers, who constantly come up with schemes to make a fortune and always explode in disaster. This time they picked the biggest sector of investment that affected everyone, the old mortgage market. Many people have counted on the equity in their home to be their nest egg. Now that largest market has been wiped out because of the stupidity of the SEC, who has persistently got down on its hands and knees and kissed the ground that Goldman Sachs walked on. The other big problem that we have is collusion between the regulators and the justice system, so that the regulators always end up winning. A classic example is my own case before Judge Owen. Judge Owen, I discovered, was altering the actual record of court proceedings, and indeed effectively admitted as much after a higher court reviewed his conduct. He wrote, "I don't remember ever making any change to a transcript of any substance. I may have stuck in a comma, I may have stuck in a dash, but I don't remember ever changing anything of substance." The courts are so dishonest, the SEC was able to get their cases before Judge Owen to ensure their victory. Judge Owen had also presided over First Jersey Securities, a brokerage house that had taken too much business away from New York. Now, you might imagine that this kind of judicial misbehaviour would be discovered and uncovered and revealed. But no, there's another problem. The Senate Judiciary Committee will just never investigate judges. So they know they can do as they like, for they're above the law. The only judges to ever get prosecuted are those who defend the Constitution and the people. If they're pro-government, the government will never criminally charge a judge who rules only in their favour. There is a very distinct pattern, that the SEC will bring cases in New York, not where the alleged offender actually resides, in order to win at all costs. I've spoken to members of the press who, one, know that judges in New York alter the public record to win cases, and two, only prosecute outside firms. You will never see any New York firm prosecuted, like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, or any of the major firms. Federal New York courts protect the likes of Goldman Sachs, preventing ever any case against them. Indeed, a major class action lawsuit was filed in New York against Merrill Lynch. It was taken by Judge Pollock, who wrote a huge opinion dismissing the case, preventing the little guy from ever having his day in court. Stepping outside of Manhattan destroys the conviction rate in questionable white-collar cases. Look at the case of Keating of S&L fame, who was criminally prosecuted on the theory that he sold bonds knowing that 7 years later he would have to file for bankruptcy. He was the sacrificial lamb for the savings and loan crisis, and when his case was overturned, the government tried to re-indict him. There, the court held it was a political prosecution and dismissed the case. Rest assured, that would never take place on the East Coast, where the courts have been stacked with mostly former prosecutors acting as reborn judges. But to understand if Goldman Sachs is the new evil empire within, we must consider its origin, evolution, and what it has now represented that has turned so many against it. One thing for sure, if it were in the computer field, the government would be attacking it like Microsoft, trying to tear it apart limb from limb. But Goldman Sachs is not Microsoft. It's a quasi-commercial bank with Fed borrowing power. Investment bank, when it smells a deal. It's a primary dealer that has the Fed hooked to the point where they fear they cannot survive without it. And above all, it's also a proprietary hedge fund that roams the world economy looking for its next prey. But how did Goldman and the other club member banks on Wall Street turn into this monster? Is it something that this arose simply from the deep unbidden, or were there structural reasons why all this took place? Well, two fundamental trends were in place. One was that computer models were getting more and more sophisticated, but at the same time more short-sighted and dangerous. And the collapse of long-term capital management is an illustration of what happened when you merged market manipulation and inside information with sophisticated computer models that didn't take into consideration what happens when the entire market goes illiquid. So what we saw, if you like, was a clash of cultures. The traditional job of Wall Street was to do high-quality financial analysis of individual companies, and based on that analysis to do stock picks to buy and hold for the long term. By comparison, the culture in the area of commodity trading was completely different. That was a field that was dominated by manipulations. There were only a few recognized storage warehouses that the commodity exchanges recognized, and that let games develop with moving product in and out of these stores to create swings in the market prices. This was the kind of culture which began to seep into the financial industry. There did develop a club in the 90s, and I know what I'm saying, says Armstrong. A number of desks would be watching the big houses and what they were up to. They would band together or leak out what a big client would be doing to get interest. This was in the commodity field, but keep in mind this culture was now infiltrating the financial markets from about 1985 onwards. So what happened with long-term capital management? Well, the crisis was a result of the inside club relying on their inside information. That told them that the IMF was going to continue loaning money to Russia. As I've written before, Edmund Safra of Republic Bank paid for a dinner to which I was invited, and many senior politicians in Washington were invited. They wanted me to join in with the club, which was then buying Russia. I declined, and I warned them that Russia would collapse. Now, they thought the best way to win was to rig the game. If they had the IMF in their back pocket, I would be wrong and they would be right. But sometimes all the inside information in the world and millions of dollars in bribes cannot prevent the free markets from doing what they do best. They refuse to comply with things that fundamentally were unsupportable, and Russia was one of these. I warned them that my model was pointing to a crash in September 98. I was supposedly manipulating the world economy because of the scope of our clients, and this was the very thing that the club saw and judged me by their own aspirations. They believed our forecasts were usually correct, not because of a model, but they believed it was because of who I knew around the world. That IMF affair in Washington was to show me that they had it in the bag. I stood up and warned them that Russia would collapse in about 30 days in the late summer in London, and it made the front page of the second section of the London Financial Times. They believed that I had more power than them, and that is why they lost on the issue of Russia, and they lost big time. Following that, strange things began to take place in our accounts. I was only in the USA about 6 weeks from late 98 until the summer of 99, preparing to go public, and I was hoping to retire to get back to research I wanted to do. But when Russia collapsed, the club was so invested in that trade that it was illiquid, lacking a tradable market. So they panicked and began selling all positions, creating a global contagion, and thus long-term capital management hit the headlines around the world. And that really was, in many ways, a model for everything that's happened since. What happened in the case of long-term capital management and this infection of trading with this aggressive commodity market manipulation approach. And speaking of commodities, let's deal with the issue of Warren Buffett. The first time I began to hear the name Warren Buffett and commodities was after he got involved to rescue Solomon. That had opened the door to Fibro, who seems to have now introduced Buffett to the glories of commodity markets. Now, the CFTC wanted to know from Fibro on whose behalf were they acting, and the secret client that Fibro refused to reveal was none other than Warren Buffett. The amazing thing is how easily the CFTC backed down. If anyone else refused to do as they commanded, they would be thrown in jail. But nevertheless, that incident is the one which began to shift these secret market manipulations overseas. This is why AIG was set up in London. They set up the entire division that blew up the world in London because they wanted to keep everything out of the vision of US regulators. They were able to muscle the CFTC, but they weren't sure if they could do it all the time. Buffett got caught up in this whole game when he came in to rescue Salomon Brothers. It was from this time forward that his name began to be associated with the so-called Wall Street Great Bubble Machine. In case you're not familiar with the term bubble machine, it came from an article in Rolling Stone in July 2009, The Great American Bubble Machine, and the opening line is, "From tech stocks to high gas prices, Goldman Sachs has engineered every major market manipulation since the Great Depression, and they're about to do it again." Now, a magazine such as Rolling Stone won't just publish an article of this nature based on wild speculation. There have to be verified sources, even if they remain unmentioned in the article. The great bubbles which the article attributes to Goldman Sachs are the Great Depression bubble in investment trusts. Shares in the trust fell from $326 to $1.75. The tech stock bubble, the housing mortgage bubble, the gasoline $4 a gallon scam, rigging the bailout, and global warming. The interesting thing about this list is it's far too short. Indeed, this is just now scratching the surface of the club that I had spent 10 years documenting, only to find, in some magical way, Alan Cohen gets appointed receiver over my company, Princeton Economics International Limited, which was a foreign corporation that no American court had any jurisdiction over. Nevertheless, Alan Cohen seizes all my research, threatens my lawyers with contempt if they don't turn over everything, throws me in contempt of court for over 7 years, lying to the court claiming there are losses when there are none, and then emerges as head of global compliance for Goldman Sachs. This conflict of interest was sanctioned by the federal courts. who've protected Goldman Sachs at every possible turn. And yet, even as the structure of the system protects these core banks, at the same time there is a public facade, especially around the issue of so-called insider information. In the past, if you knew, for example, your company is about to make a significant loss and in advance you sell shares, certainly that's insider information. But especially in the commodities arena, insider information is often attributed to issues which are pure observation. For example, if you watch what somebody's doing and you watch what they're buying, and then you start to make decisions based on that and your assessment of them as a trader, that's just good observation. It's not inside information. And yet this giant distraction is run. For example, they criminally wasted tons of money to put a show on to prosecute Martha Stewart, claiming she'd lied to the FBI. Now, besides the fact it would be fantastic if those in government could be prosecuted for lying to people, what's really going on is it's creating a giant distraction to make people think the courts and the Justice Department are really protecting the public rather than the club. For by putting Martha on trial, they create the image that no one's above the law. The real problem is that the judges, prosecutors and their friends are untouchable. For example, back in the mid-1980s, Michael Milken was at Drexel Burnham Lambert, a Philadelphia firm where I myself once had accounts. They were an outsider insofar as the tight New York houses were concerned, and Milken was truly an original thinker. He created a major innovation that advanced financing and in fact contributed to the expansion of the US economy and its job market. What he created was the opposite of how the New York crowd operate. The traditional banking model was still hip deep in the old railroad model that meant they lent against assets, but Milken took a new approach, was to lend against turnover and profit rather than hard assets, and by focusing on profit he created the innovative market that gave birth to many new companies and created jobs. But Milken's problem was that he stole the thunder from the New York crowd, and that really pissed them off. They no doubt complained about the junk bond market started by Milken because they'd been shown up and they'd missed the boat. Now, the only way to compete in their books is to use the feds to go after a competitor and clear the decks. They did. Milken was innocent, but they invented a law where he did not need insider information from a company, just that now two people going to take over a company create their own insider information. But this was how the commodity and currency market had always operated. Monitor the competition and guess what their next move will be. Milken vowed to go to trial. However, the government had no case, and they were set in motion by the New York crowd. They included Milken's brother in the indictment, trying to force him to plead to save his family. They then took it to the next level and threatened to indict his 90-year-old grandfather. Milken was known to be a family man. He caved in, and the US government acted like some third world dictatorship, ruthlessly extorting confessions. The courts just sit there and let this go on. The Supreme Court takes the truly absurd position that the government needs to prosecute criminally, meaning that judges and prosecutors must be absolutely immune, so they do not hesitate to prosecute. This view, of course, means the Constitution has no real force, for Article 2 says they may only faithfully execute the laws, not with malice and total disregard for everything we fought and died for, that the average person believes is the American dream. We had a revolution, and Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence the very complaint that the king was protecting his agents with mock trials. We do the same. You cannot sue any government attorney nor a judge, and because of that you can have evidence that they were even bribed, but you cannot proceed, for only the government, like the king, can criminally charge, and it will not do so as long as that judge and prosecutor lied, manipulated and cheated to benefit the government. It was in 1986 that the government went after Ivan Boesky on insider trading and compelled him to plead guilty, paying a fine of $100 million. They now turned to boldly destroy Milken, Drexel Burnham, curiously prosecuting them in New York. The firm pled guilty and paid a $650 million fine. Drexel ended up having to default on $100 million in loans. Did this really benefit the public? No. Real people lost real money. Milken pled guilty in 1990. He was fined $600 million. The New York crowd had done their job well. Drexel believed in competition. They weren't part of the club. But then, neither was Bear Stearns, and neither was Lehman Brothers. The outside firms are the ones who go down. By the time of the Asian currency crisis, the rot had set in deep. But this time, people in other governments were starting to notice the club in action. It appeared that the currencies of Southeast Asia were being attacked by a school of sharks, and the feeding frenzy was growing. There were bolder attempts to start screwing with the world economy for short-term hits. No one would speak out, and I was starting to get very tired of panic and crisis management. It was becoming more and more strange that I seemed to be running around trying to save something that no one else seemed to care about. The club left its fingerprints all over this one. Political leaders in Southeast Asia were starting to publicly complain about the wave of professional trading that was targeting their countries. The club was becoming a sociopathic organization, where they cared only about instant profit, and to hell with the rest of the world. I'd like to move beyond the analysis that Martin Armstrong is providing there on this issue of what he's just described about the actions of the club and their feeding frenzy in the Asian currencies. Let me take him back to his own mention of the IMF in relation to long-term capital management and the Russia crisis. And we know from, for example, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, the IMF were involved in the business of advocating policies to countries that were designed to cause those countries to fail, designed to drive those countries into debt, and designed to drive those countries into the arms of lenders and into the arms of the New World Order. And so when Armstrong's writing here and talking about the club becoming sociopathic, caring only about short-term hits, short-term profit, and to hell with the economic consequences, I diverge from that. It wasn't a question of to hell with the economic consequences. The economic consequences which took place as a result of these attacks on Asian currencies and as a result of IMF actions were designed by the New World Order to absolutely cripple any other country who was a potential competitor, emerging economies, and to keep these countries dependent, to keep them economically weak. This was economic warfare, and I'd suggest to Martin Armstrong that the actions of the club in the Asian currency crisis and in many other countries around the world was absolutely knowing that the short-term hits were there, the short-term profits were there, but it wasn't a question of nobody shouting stop. It was a question that this had been green-lighted by the New World Order. And I believe that that has always been the case, that the actions of the Wall Street Club are green-lighted by the New World Order. They are politically driven as well as economically driven. Anyway, continuing with Armstrong's story. I started to become more and more concerned about rising volatility. I turned to the computer to inquire about this problem, and the projections I was getting back truly scared the hell out of me. I was looking at the future of Western civilization being led down a path of total, insane destruction. For you see, with the ratcheting up of volatility is also entwined the escalating forces of political instability. These two were in fact historically always interlinked. The phone kept ringing crisis after crisis, but the boldness was also rising from the club, and it seemed we were headed into a serious conflict, and they would not listen. I was invited by China to fly to Beijing and arrive to meet with the central bank to discuss this problem of the Asian currency crisis. They were quite concerned about the rising volatility, but political issues restrained them from speaking publicly. They encouraged me to speak out and to make the points I'd been writing about. Their staff had worked on the trading desks in the West at major banks and knew my concerns were real, and they wanted me to be public about my concerns. Now, I was finding myself becoming a sort of international priest that countries would complain to in the hopes I would relay the message. We were becoming a clearinghouse, so to speak, and the pressure was clearly building. I began to start openly writing about the organized manipulations. I was not at the time giving names, but I would start to warn, quote, "they're back," for example, in an effort to tone down what was becoming insane. Indeed, speaking of the growing rapaciousness of the club, it was in the 90s when the club first began to be known as the Billionaires Club, because it was expanding to now include individuals. As I've explained, the first time I heard of Warren Buffett becoming a trader rather than an investor was in '93 with the first silver manipulation. I assumed that his involvement with Salomon Brothers had now exposed him as a potential client for Fibro, who did one hell of a good job selling him on investing in silver. The whole CFTC confrontation, I also assumed, was merely trying to protect him personally from the negative publicity of speculating in silver. As time went on, his name began to pop up more frequently. The talk of the desks behind the scenes was that he was even pulling in Bill Gates into some of these deals. I never bothered to confirm that was true, but it's one of the reasons why the club began to be known as the Billionaires Club behind the curtain. There were rumours of expanding into the ranks of hedge funds. Long-term capital management wasn't the only one said to be involved. They returned to silver in 1997. I put out a warning to clients they're back and they were going to take silver to $7 and crash it again. Once more, the name of Warren Buffett was attached. The head trader from AIG got in to see me from London by getting a board member who had been Margaret Thatcher's chief economic advisor to call me for a meeting. I was shocked when it turned out to be about silver. I was asked to stop talking about the manipulations and politely asked to keep my mouth shut. I declined, just saying that I wouldn't mention names. They didn't find that good enough. So an analyst in Connecticut, most likely on the payroll of the club, used his contacts to get the Wall Street Journal after me. When I got the call, I was being accused of trying to manipulate silver. We argued. The journalist demanded I give him the name of the mysterious manipulator. I got mad and finally told him it was Warren Buffett. And he replied, everyone knew Buffett didn't trade commodities. And I said, that's how much everybody knows. They came out with a story blaming me. And the London newspapers ran stories now claiming that I was the largest silver trader in the world. The problem was, this was all public now, and the CFTC called asking where the silver manipulation was. But I said to them, it's in London. They called the Bank of England, who summoned all the silver brokers for an urgent meeting the next day. Buffett came out and admitted he bought $1 billion worth of silver, and he denied manipulating the market. Such a position was illegal under CFTC rules, but nothing happened, and Buffett stopped any investigation dead in its tracks by the admission. This was the closest they ever came to be exposed. Whether Buffett is a full member or a pawn is a real question, but $1 billion in silver is manipulation in US regulations. The boldness of the club simply took off. They knew that the Japanese brought back their cash in March for fiscal year end and then reinvested in April. The club was targeting the Japanese yen for the March rollover in 1999. It was getting out of hand. I found myself at great odds with the club, for my job was to protect my clients. From their perspective, I was a threat to their entire operation. I stood up at our annual conference in Tokyo, held at the old Imperial Hotel, and warned the entire audience that the yen was the next target. I warned that they had to lock in the currency when they sold it for the roll, or else they were going to be squeezed big time. The Japanese understood what I was telling them to do. They did it. The roll was probably in the tens of billions, if not more. My clients protected themselves and the yen squeeze failed. I was told by several currency desks at the time that the club had lost around $1 billion on it. No doubt. Now developing an all-out war between myself and the club. I was strongly against these manipulations, for I saw them as increasing volatility, not altering the cycle per se, but that would undermine the entire economy, creating wave after wave of building instability. I saw a giant wave of building volatility that these guys were too stupid to realize what they were doing. That was only the half of it. At the same time, the club was lobbying hard to get rid of the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act that prevented securities, banking and insurance industries from expanding into one another's business. That was repealed in 1999, championed by guess who? Robert Rubin, who was now Secretary of the United States Treasury. Meanwhile, Henry Paulson, then head of Goldman Sachs, was lobbying the SEC, who regulated investment banks, to allow them to use much higher leverage. The whole financial industry was now being turned on its head, and the manipulations were getting bigger and bigger. There had been much hope about Russia opening up and joining the democratic and capitalistic free markets, but the undertone of Russia had always been corrupt in its political circles. Yeltsin just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and standing on a tank was good enough to now qualify him to run the country. There was a great hope rising in St. Petersburg that many in the West were at that time looking to as a possible leader for Russia. She was running for mayor of St. Petersburg and was shockingly assassinated, shot in the head, execution style. The press in Russia was given the story that she was a pawn of a Western financier. My phone began to ring and I was asked for comments on the incident. I said I had no idea why they were calling me. I was then told that her son was working in our London office and that mere connection was been spun into involving me. I thought at the time it was a desperate connection that made no sense. Later it would seem to be somehow a scheme to tie me to Russia as perhaps cover for themselves. The truth behind this mess was that at least Edmund Safra was deeply involved in the blackmail of Yeltsin to step down so they could gain control of all Russian resources to manipulate the market. Two versions exist where either Baranovsky would become the new head or he would install Putin, assuming he would be a puppet. Either way, the $7 billion disappears, Yeltsin mysteriously calls off the election, and Putin comes from nowhere. Baranovsky, after being an advisor to Putin, flees Russia, and the mastermind, Edmund Safra, is murdered in Monaco within weeks. The truth may not come out for 50 years, like the Kennedy assassination. Assassination may be a strong word, but it's spot on for the fate that Edmund Safra suffered in Monaco on December the 3rd, 1999. Within less than 10 days, the death of Safra scared the hell out of the US government, and, as I say, within 10 days they moved to throw me in jail on civil contempt for an alleged missing 1.3 million out of 3 billion. My partners overseas had an attorney in the court to observe. He got out of the courtroom and relayed to them that I was being railroaded, and under no circumstances should they ever come to the United States. They haven't been here since. Dominic Dunn, the celebrated journalist, covered the real story of Safra's death, that he was assassinated by the Russians. By the end of that week, in any event, the FBI was taking computers and records, raiding the Princeton offices. Dominic said of Edmund that he knew all the secrets of the financial planet. He had long been suspected of laundering money for Noriega, as well as the Colombian drug cartels, and both his bank and his private jet were alleged to have been pressed into service to move money and personnel during the Iran-Contra scandal. Let's pause for a moment. Armstrong definitely needs to connect the dots back into the New World Order here, because he's talking about the drug cartels, who we know are deeply in bed with Wall Street and with the intelligence apparatus in the United States, and he's also talking there about him having a role in the Iran-Contra scandal, meaning he's connected to the Iran-Contra network. The Iran-Contra network is Bush Sr.'s private intelligence service. Elements within the CIA who were driven out during the Stansfield-Turner review ordered by Jimmy Carter, which was either the dumbest move ever because it drove intelligence agents out into this black intelligence agency, or was the smartest move ever because it was actually a ploy to split those agents off from the CIA and to enroll them into the new Black Operations Agency. That's the agency involved with Iran-Contra scandal. George Bush Sr. is at the core of the New World Order. He's Mr. New World Order, and as I say, Armstrong needs to connect some dots here in relation to what he's described there about Edmund Safra. Anyhow, continuing. Putin's anti-capitalist feelings came out once he had the power, and it was clear that Putin was no puppet. Within just a few weeks, Safra is fleeing Geneva for his Monaco sanctuary and is killed on December the 3rd, 1999. Baranovsky, who's said to have made Putin, flees to London, where he was given political asylum. Kaczynski fled to Israel. No one can explain why Yeltsin, a free market guy, would turn Russia back to a former KGB for no reason. Now, the reason may be deeper than it seems. Why Putin? Why Yeltsin? See, the intelligence agencies are the iron fist within the velvet glove of political and financial power. And the intelligence agencies of the United Kingdom, the United States and Russia are deeply involved in the power structure. So did the KGB ever go away, or was there merely a series of staged events, the rise and rise of Putin, something that isn't accidental but is actually part of a long-term and deeper plan? That's perhaps a good place to pause. That's part one of Martin Armstrong's story, and I will be back tomorrow with part two, continuing with more details of what's going on behind the curtain. We'll be taking a look at Elliot Spitzer, we'll be taking a look at the mortgage manipulation, and we'll be taking a look at the bailout issues and more in the next part, and I do hope you can take the time to join me for that. But in the meantime, for breakfornews.com, this has been Fintan Dunn reporting. So for those of you who do wish to catch up on where we're at so far on breakfornews.com on this issue, you could begin by googling WAG the WTC and take a read of that article. That will take you back to within weeks of 9/11, that first investigative article. You could then Google CIA fakes. Just click on the first link that comes up, which details a lot of our analysis of the 9/11 issue. Then you could try the forum on breakfornews.com. The 9/11 section there has a series of audios called 9/11 Without Tinfoil, about 6-7 audios there. And then you can check the 9/11 section of breakfornews.com in entirety. And there you'll find a lot of very smart analysis over a long time by a lot of smart people. That's how, if you're new to all this, you can catch up with where we've got to so far. So now, let's move on. So, how do we get a handle on something as complex as the relationship between the financial markets and the political structures, both in London and in New York, at the heart of our problems? It's such a vast topic, it's so complicated, there's just so many different perspectives on it. But for me, one perspective stands out. It's the perspective of an individual who is supremely qualified, because we're talking about somebody who was a spectacularly successful hedge fund trader. We're also talking about somebody who had legendary capacity to predict the markets, or it would be legendary if only this person was a bit more well known. Screwed by Republicans, screwed by Democrats, screwed by the Washington power structure, by the Washington-London New World Order. In fact, a new motive for 9/11 has begun to loom, and that motive is money. And in a previous audio at the beginning of this year, I mentioned that what's missing is something in the order of in excess of $200 trillion from the United States is missing. So does that sound like motive enough? Could it be one of the core motives? Is it a big enough figure for you? Let's just estimate it conservatively at 200 trillion, accounting for about 120 trillion of unfunded and current liabilities of the United States government, and at least the same again in disappeared national assets, manufacturing capability, economic strength, wasted, gone, transferred overseas. That's enough motivation. So what is that big picture? Well, let's use Google Earth to look at the site of the World Trade Center from overhead, and then begin to zoom out. We don't zoom out very far before we realize that the events of 9/11 took place not a stone's throw from Wall Street, the center of financial power of the New World Order in the United States. And so we ask, considering the motive, considering the money, what's the relationship between the Wall Street boys and what happened on 9/11? Now, I know you seasoned veterans want to just get straight on with it, but there may be those for whom this is the first audio they've tuned into on the 9/11 issue. Someone who dealt at governmental level and who knows all of the key players. There's one other thing. This person's currently incarcerated, a guest of the US judicial system. This is somebody who is imprisoned at this time. Some of you may have guessed it already. I'm talking about, of course, Martin Armstrong. Martin who, you say? Never heard of him. Well, that's no thanks to the mainstream media. Gretchen Morgenstern in the New York Times, one of the few journalists in the New York Times, has covered his story, as has Money Week in the UK in 2007. So just to start off about who this guy is, if you haven't heard about him, and somebody that I've been following for some years, just put Martin Armstrong into Google and up will come a CIApedia, or Wikipedia to give it its other name, a Wikipedia article about Martin Armstrong. I'm going to quote from that. Martin Armstrong, born 1950, is the former chairman of Princeton Economics International Limited, indicted in 1999 on charges of bilking Japanese investors. He spent 7 years jailed for contempt of court before finally pleading guilty in 2007. He's now serving a 5-year sentence for conspiracy to commit fraud, and that doesn't even begin to touch on the egregious abuse of judicial process in the Armstrong case. Incredible. Let me quote from the New Yorker article about Martin Armstrong on that issue of what happened in the trial, so-called, eventually. In Armstrong's civil trial, the judge... And you're very welcome. This is The Beautiful Truth, with Fintan Dunn reporting. So what is 9/11 deja vu? It's not quite like regular deja vu. It's a persistent, recurring feeling that a grievous and horrible crime has been committed, mass murder, and that the perpetrators have not been brought to justice. It's a feeling that just won't leave. Now, if you're new to the analysis here on breakfornews.com, you might be saying to yourself, I've been in and out of all the detail on 9/11. Well, I've got news for you. That's precisely how you're supposed to feel. Get it? And if you're going to talk to anybody else about the 9/11 issue, somebody who's clued in, who's been through the material, that's the first point you should make to them in trying to get across what we're dealing with here in this new series. Inasmuch as the existing set of red herrings that have been fed to us have been lots of detail, then the devil has been in the detail on 9/11. And that detail is an orgy of evidence. And you can Google that, orgy of evidence, breakfornews.com, to get to the audio about that topic and the use of that tactic against you. So, bearing that in mind, inasmuch as I say, it's been about the detail, instead, we're going to approach it from the opposite end, and we're going to look from the big picture and drill down to the detail. That's how Albert Einstein worked it out. That's how breakthroughs are made. Albert Einstein comes up with a new big picture and then begins to drill down to the detail. That's how you can tell what's really going on, and that's what we'll be doing. We'll be starting with the big picture. And speaking of big pictures, you might remember the movie Get Shorty. Danny DeVito says to John Travolta, he asks him in relation to a movie he's being pitched, he says, well, what's my motivation here? Good question. Because the issue of motivation is at the core of the 9/11 issue. Why would they do it? In any murder, what is the motive? No point in having suspicions about somebody. If a team of detectives is working on a murder case, okay, they may have suspicions, but the question is, so what was the motive? And from the motive, we can work out who did it. So, what was the motive? Now, in this regard, the years have been kind to us, though they are coming up on 9 long years since the event. They've been kind to us in this regard that in the early days of 9/11 research, a lot of people looking for a motive looked to the oil in Iraq, perhaps, as the motive, or the military-industrial complex wanting to start a new war as the motive, or wanting to go after the oil pipelines in Afghanistan as the motive, or it being Bush and the neocons and Dick Cheney and all that horrible, nasty right-wing crew who surely must be the kind of people who would have pulled that kind of thing off. And yet, as I say, the years have been kind to us because they've broadened our understanding of how screwed we are. Not just